Kim's office. For my grade 6 Sky Science unit, I would like to read a couple of chapters of a book I was first introduced to in my university days when I was studying geology. And the cover is well torn. I have a picture of it in the unit that I've put in. It's Charlie Farquason's History of Canada, as told to Valida Drain Farquason when it was too wet to plow. And on the bottom it says, she was a drain on her father's side. Now, this book was written by a Canadian comedian quite some time ago. It says, he may not be a great speller, but his sense of humor, sense of grammar, time, and cause and effect may not always be right, but he's all Charlie. And it's a very comedic look at history of Canada, history of the earth, etc. So I'm just going to read you a couple of chapters, and I like how it's laid out. This is your contents, your table of contents, your introduction, your foreword, your universal. He pretended to be a really poorly educated dirt farmer from the Maritimes, and so he talks in slang and very poor English, but hopefully you'll find it funny. The introduction goes like this. I wonder how many of us, gentle readers, smug in the knowledge that during our academic years we had a pretty solid grounding in Canadian history, can explain why we have two major railroads running across this country. Be honest now, did you really know that it all came about when two construction teams, one heading east and the other heading west, missed each other by a country mile at the rendezvous point, hard by your Kicking Horse Pass, and then proceeded on, laying rail independently till they reached the coast? You might want to check those facts. I learned this from Charlie Farquason as I let him lead me down a long corridor of quiet time that is Canadian history. It's generally conceded to be one of the dullest and dreariest walks in the world. Really? No, Canadian history used to be dull. Not anymore. Not the way we teach it now. But with Charlie as your guide, you just don't want to come back. It's just great history. It's a great story. What a wonderful breath of fresh Parry Sound air to blow away the dust and cobwebs. It's Charlie's first literary venture, this book. And thank goodness he hasn't learned the professional's trick of pacing himself. Charlie comes out of your literary blocks like Jesse Owens and goes like Billy be darned to the very end. There's no conserving energy here. No doling out of a bon mot, maybe every third page to make creative inspiration last. The sparks of brilliance fly off every second word and come at you like a salvo out of your average old rattling gat guns. Now, that probably didn't make much sense to you guys, but it will. Now there's Valida, his wife, Valida Drain. Poor, long-suffering Valida, peering over his shoulder all the while, hoping that what he has to say won't get them ridden out of Parry Sound on a rail. Because some of what he says might be pretty offensive to some people. Whenever Charlie gets too outrageous, the steadying hand of his wife Valida is always there on the form of a feet note. Now, for those of you younger listeners, you might not understand that a footnote is when you have a reference up here and you want an explanation that isn't part of the actual story part. They put a little footnote at the bottom that says, I got this information from blah, blah, blah. That's a footnote. Well, Charlie calls them feet note because when there's more than one, it's got to be a feet note, plural, right? She's always there in the form of a feet note, setting things straight, counteracting the off-color muse that whispers in Charlie's ear. All right. I won't get into the whole rest of that introduction, but let's go right into Charlie's foreword to the book, your foreword. Now, I'm talking in Charlie's voice. Well, sir, I suppose you'd like to know how Charlie Farquason came to all of a sudden one day be historical. I mind it was last spring. I was out with the tractor just this side of my hardwood bush. I'd finished up the spring plowing, so I was having kind of a harrowing day. Oh, harrows is an old piece of farm equipment, and harrowing day is, he does a lot of these plays on words where a word has more than one meaning. It's not too bad when you plower, but my golly, when you're on the harrows, you have to stop all the time to get them big stones out in the way. Picking rocks on the farm, getting the rocks out of the way so you can plow. Well, sir, I'd just gotten off my Alice Chalmers, that's the name of my tractor for you city folks, and I was just starting to pry a fair-sized piece of granite out in the pathway of the harrows, when I seen this fella leaning forninst the fence. He was there watching me heave my stones. Now you take your average stranger leaning forninst a fence, whatever that means, and that's all he's doing. Means one of two things: either he's one of them unemployables, or he's working for your government. Turns out this fella's a genealogist. I think he means geologist. A genealogist is quite different, but he gets them mixed up because he's not so well educated. I figure he's a genealogist working for the Department of your Mind and Resources. No, not Minds and Resources. Mind your own resources. He was going around the country collecting samples of rocks. That's all he was doing, and getting paid for it, too. And he was just waiting till I got off my tractor before he asked me if I minded him getting some rocks off the farm. My golly, says, you can just folly along in front of the harrows and take all of them, I says. And what do I want those for? But what in the Sam Hill do you want with all those rocks anyway? And you know what this sibilant servant told me? He means civil servant, not sibilant. He told me that the rocks hard by my hardwood bush was over 2,500,000,000 year old. Now, I know them government fellows is fond of your inflation, but my gall, even if you cut her in half, that's still old. 2,500,000,000? That can't be. He called my rocks funny names, too. Now, you take your average rock on a farm, it pretty well allus take 'em for granite. Oh, fun, granite rocks, oh, granite, oh. But this fella says, you take away your topsoil, and when you get right down to it, the Farquason farm is just a lot of schist. Now, I could talk geology all day, but yeah, schist is a kind of rock. That's what she's called, your Precambrian schist. And what was dropping off by them glaciers, just after your last ice age. Now, when I say your last ice age, I'm not talking about your winter of 71 when we had 12 foot of snow. If you're going to look this thing real historical, you're going to have to go way back, way beyond that. Besides, I don't want to say too much about your winter here in Canada. I figure if you don't say too much, maybe it'll go away like it once did between the ice ages, and everything got calm and balmy for a time. Your climate is a main factor of your history, and most of Canada is even today outdoors. And it makes for an awful lot of hopping, jumping, and running about just to keep warm, especially this week. Instead of getting down to business, I figure your whole history of our country would have been different if your temperature had been raised just a few degrees Fahrenheit. If you take your average temperature, even today, it's pretty mean. Oh, mean temperature means average. Oh, corny. Anyway, if you're ready, put your feet in the stove and we'll get started with my Oriole History of Canada. He means oral, said out loud, as opposed to Oriole, the bird. It just means it was took down by my wife Valida, right and fast as Billy O, just as it come out of my mouth. I would have written it down myself, but Valida says nobody's going to read writing when it's written rotten. Seems there's two kinds of history, your Oriole and your annual, but I ain't got the time to do this every year. So that's the first part. Part 2 coming next.